I'd like to introduce Mr. Tom Luce, founder of Texas 2036, who will interview Mr. H. Ross Perot Jr. Tom was the founding and managing partner of the Hughes and Luce law firm. He was lead attorney on multi-billion-dollar mergers and litigation, and was selected at various points in his career as one of the best attorneys in Dallas. Wow. So we're doing it differently this time. Let me continue introducing Tom, if you don't mind. Or would you rather just get started? I don't know. But let me brag about you just a little bit more. His public service in Texas was distinguished by appointments to major state positions, including Chief Justice of the Supreme Court pro tem, Sunset Commissioner, Cancer Prevention and Research Institute, Texas Commission on the Judiciary, and Chief of Staff of the Select Committee on Public Education. On a national level, he was Assistant Secretary of Education and on the board of the Library of Congress. Mr. Luce, take it away.
Thank you. Ross, welcome. They
Tom,
should have
thank
given
you.
you an introduction like that. I mean, I could have written a really good one for you. Thank you for...
Well, you're the best lawyer in the state, so I don't agree with one of the best.
I'm on step 11 of the 12-step process in terms of being a lawyer, so I think I'm almost withdrawn. First of all, let me thank TAMEST for the opportunity to talk about the legacy of Ross Perot Sr. He was a remarkable individual that had a tremendous impact on the state and on this country, and my relationship with him goes back 45 years, and with Ross Jr. that long, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to reflect on some of the impact that he had, because a lot of what he worked on was innovation, which is the subject of this conference. And I'd start really by the fact, I think it's kind of forgotten, I'm old enough to remember of that, Ross Perot really created what we now call the IT industry, or the computer services industry. Prior to his starting with EDS, most of the IT industry was considered hardware manufacturers like IBM and Univac, and computers were used mostly for government applications, research, and it was really Ross Perot's vision that created what we now call the IT services industry. And I've tried to explain to his grandchildren, he was really the predecessor, kind of combined, of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Michael Dell, and it was a generation before. So given that vision and that focus he always had about what was going to occur in the future, and it was really his vision that created that service industry, he was always vitally interested in research and innovation in our state. I think my first experience in dealing with that went back to the early 80s when he asked me to help him in terms of looking at the future of education in the state in the early 80s, and he was very focused on the fact that the Texas economy was going to change from a resource-based economy. We'd basically been an agricultural state, a natural resource state, into a human capital state. And he always used to say to me, the competition in the world for the next 50 years is going to be about talent, who can attract talent. So he was always attracted to that, and that led to efforts like Sematech. He spent a lot of effort on the original efforts to bring Sematech together in Austin, which I think led to the boom of Austin really as a tech center. Those who've forgotten, there was a consortium that really allowed our semiconductor industry to catch up with the rest of the world. So he's done a lot of remarkable things, and his son has continued in that light. And Ross, I really want to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the things that Hillwood is continuing to do and some of the legacies you've seen your father to do with that introduction.
Well, Tom, thank you, and I thank you for the invitation to be here. It's certainly a critical topic for our state and the growth of our state. And if you look at the future of Texas, it is one of the high-growth states in the United States. The numbers are very positive, and the biggest challenge we have in our state is we're going to keep the growth We have to bring in more and more people, but we have to train the people and the citizens we have already to get ready for the growth. There are about 29 million people are in the state today. We should be well over 40 million people by 2040. And so you've got these growth rates. North Texas we're almost 8 million people today. We'll be 16 million people by 2040. So you have, right now, we are 500 people a day roughly moving into Dallas-Fort Worth. And so at those kind of rates, we need everything, but human talent is always going to be the foundation of it. And the American Enterprise Institute came out with their study that says basically North Texas, when you put in all the variables, is the top STEM city now in the United States. Because we have, in addition, the education, but we have affordability. But I think, Tom, the most critical part about our state is an attitude. We're a very optimistic, pro-business, pro-growth state. I was with the Secretary of the Army last night. We had an event in our office, and the Secretary talked about Army Futures Command, and he talked about how he was in charge of picking where Army Futures Command would go. And he said, every state I went to, the governors would say, well, what will you do for us? He said, when I came to Texas, Governor Abbott says, what can I do for you? And the state was very aggressive in helping the Army financially and with other support to bring the Army into Austin. And that is a huge move for our state to bring more and more military into our state. The military is a critical part of our economy today. We are pro-military, and you're seeing our military continue to grow in the state because of this positive attitude. If you look at the corporate headquarters moving into Texas, the latest is Chuck Schwab. Chuck Schwab just announced he's leaving San Francisco and bringing his headquarters to Dallas-Fort Worth. And when Chuck started with a big campus, and we're the developer of that campus, so we work with Chuck on this. And so when Chuck announced the deal, the governor came down, and Chuck Schwab, with our governor, basically stood up and he said, if San Francisco is a beautiful city, if you want to have a great weekend, if you want to have great arts, great restaurants, come and visit. But he said, if you want to build a business and raise a family, you do it in Texas. And Chuck Schwab is one of the leaders of California, one of the great leaders of San Francisco, but that's the type of migration we're seeing off the West Coast into Texas because of this positive attitude, and we want you. We want that growth. 83,000 people moved from California to Texas last year. It's one of the great feeder states now into our state. So with this growth, with these opportunities, we have to have the manpower, we have to get the education up to speed, and we've got fabulous institutions in our state that we have to nurture and continue to grow, and that's what my father did throughout his career. With EDS, he had the idea. He was a salesman for IBM. He was selling hardware. He became the top hardware salesman in IBM for the year. And he actually sold his quota in the first month of the year. And he went back to IBM and says, look, I need more machines to sell. And IBM says, look, Ross, if we give you more machines, you're so good, you're going to make more money than the president of IBM. And Dad said, well, what's wrong with that? And they go, well, we can't have it. And so Dad went to IBM and says, look, I'm out selling hardware, but our clients don't want hardware. The clients really want the services that the hardware can provide. He goes, let's start a service company. And IBM says, no, we don't want to do a service company. So my father had an idea, and he had, in effect, his annual paycheck showed up in the first month of the year. And as you like to tell the story, then he was in the Navy, and he was at the Naval Academy. And then he went to IBM, and the Navy kept sending him letters saying they wanted him back in the Navy. He said, okay, I'm going to take this bet. I was born, my sister was born, so he had a young family. He had an idea, and he went out and started EDS with this young idea. And he said, look, if it didn't work, I'd go back in the Navy. That was his backup plan. He made 63 sales calls. Finally, a fellow entrepreneur picked him up, Mr. Lay at Frito-Lay. And Mr. Lay, and Dad was selling Mr. Lay, he said, look, Ross, I don't know what you're doing, but you have so upset IBM that IBM is in here the morning before you got here saying, don't hire Perot. And he said, so I like that. I mean, I like a guy that's a disruptor. I like these young entrepreneurs. So this entrepreneur, Mr. Lay, gave my father the break to start EDS, and that's what launched EDS. And so Fritos are still a big product in our house today. And Lay's potato chips, of course. So, but that was the atmosphere, that was the attitude, and that attitude is still here. And that pro-growth attitude, quality of life attitude, we're extremely affordable. And when you work with our cities, you work with our governor especially, he will welcome you into this state. And so it's up to us to get the human factors ready to continue to grow. I can tell more stories, Tom, but I'll
Well, I think also important to this audience, as much as an entrepreneur as your father was, he was also always took the time to invest in the quality academic institutions in our state, such as Southwestern Medical School, which you can talk about a lot, UTD, the creation of UTD as a 4-year institution. He was always into the future of the state. He understood the power of research. He was always, as I said at the beginning, he was always focused on how does Texas attract the talent. And he was, in his mind, it really all was about human capital. And I think what most people don't understand about Texas from the outside is how willing Texas voters have been willing to invest in research. I mean, if you look at the creation of CIPRIT, then the renewal of CIPRIT, the investment we've made in higher education, in our medical schools, the state and the voters, we have a reputation of low tax, which we applaud and want, but we've always said the best investment we can make is in academic research. And we've got to continue that because that's what fosters that innovation. And we've got some wonderful institutions. And your dad invested quite a bit in Southwestern.
He did.
I know you can talk about that. I see Kern's out there in the audience. And your dad invested a lot of money in research at Southwestern.
But I think my father, he loved to help the community. He wanted to help the state. He wanted to help the country. He loved to help people. And he would spend his days, he obviously built his business, but a lot of his days was helping other people. And I think where's Kern Wildenthal? It was Kern and it was Dan Podolsky, who runs the med school. So Kern and Dan, work with my father, but Kern really started bringing my father into the med school and the research. And as Brown and Goldstein, when they started their great work, my father went to see Brown and Goldstein. And the story I heard is he said, what do you guys need? And he said, how do you spend your time? And Brown Goldstein said, look, a lot of times on research, but also we have to spend a lot of time raising money. My father says, look, why don't you guys do the research? I'll give you the money. And so that was a partnership they formed, and what Kern formed, and we continue to support the med school today on their basic research, is providing that research in. And my father loved to help Kern and Dan recruit really great scientists into Dallas-Fort Worth. And so he was an active part of the recruiting team to bring the scientists in, to bring in that great human capital to continue to build these research universities. He then did it in MD Anderson, and again, constantly helping anywhere he could. And then if you look at Gulf War syndrome,
Right.
which he worked with the med school and Dr. Haley on. And after the Gulf War, if you go back to the beginning of his work with the military, he was very active in helping the prisoners of war in Vietnam in the late 60s and 70s. And he had some wives came to him and said, they basically said, Mr. Perot, our husbands have been shot down. We don't know if they're alive. We don't know if they're dead. We don't know what's happened. Can you help us? So my father took on that cause and really helped drive American public opinion to support our prisoners of war in Vietnam. And so that plugged him into the military. And now Gulf War syndrome happened. And he had soldiers call him that were very ill from the war, and no one knew what happened to them and why they were so ill. And the military tried to say it was combat stress. They tried to push it off, but my father said, no, there's something here. He worked with the medical school. He worked with Dr. Haley and K. Bailey Hutchinson, Senator Hutchinson, and the three of them put the research together, the politics together. And I think we had, 40 or 50,000 of our soldiers and were infected by nerve agents from the war in Iraq. And it was at that effort that we put the research money in, but also helped get these soldiers back to as strong a life as they possibly could have. But Tom, as you know, as the wars went, soldiers were hurt. And if they couldn't get fixed through normal military medicine, my father developed a reputation that if you couldn't get fixed, call Ross Perot. And soldiers would call my father and families would call my father. He'd go to the med school, and the medical school would put together a team of doctors, and if we didn't have the specialties, you bring in specialists from around the country, and again, we would heal these men and women back to as well as we can in our society. And so he was constantly being plugged in with great doctors and supporting these doctors. It was a passion of his to help others.
My favorite story about Brown and Goldstein, of course, was, and Kern and Dan are here, I don't remember the exact story, but after they won the Nobel Prize, Ross wanted to host a dinner because he said he was tired of athletes being the only ones who got big awards and not honored with big dinners. So he hosted a dinner for Brown and Goldstein to highlight the award of the Nobel Prize to the two gentlemen. So he was a classic combination of understanding the entrepreneurial mindset, but also understanding the power of the academic community, and also of the fact you could turn research into commercialization and into disruption. And being a disruptor as he was always looking out in the horizon. And I think the challenges that our state faces is how do we keep this growth engine growing? And as you and I have talked, you've been very supportive of this, Ross. The effort of Texas 2036 is really to develop a long-term strategic plan of how do we deal with the major systemic issues that the state faces to be able to accommodate this growth, keep the growth engine going, keep the things going that made Texas successful while handling this growth, which is absolutely essential. Our data shows, Ross mentioned, we'll probably be at 41 million people by 2036. Our research indicates we've got to create 8 million jobs between now and 2036 to keep unemployment where it is today. To put that number in context, that's as many jobs as exist in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston combined today. So in essence, how do you replicate an economy the size of North Texas and Houston? And we've been dependent for quite a while, fortunately, upon gigantic domestic migration, gigantic international migration, which has been better educated than our native population. And so we're basically in a race to make sure we can better educate native population while encouraging the migration, because migration is slowing. Now, it's slowing from record highs, but as I like to say, we may have already gotten everybody out of California that wants to work. I mean, Jim Breyer may be the last move. And so, the issue is how do we make sure that we keep this growth engine going? And it's going to depend upon innovation and continuing to keep that innovation going depends upon the growth of our academic institutions. And it's a constant battle to get enough funding for our academic institutions, but it's critical to the future of our state. And we've got to do a better job of communicating that to the public. But Texas voters, I mean, keep in mind, it's very rare. State voters approved $1 billion of bonds to fund cancer research and then renewed it last November. And fortunately, a lot of that money was used to attract scientists and researchers from across the country because the program started after the bust in 2007 and 8, and we were able to take advantage of the fact that other states were cutting back on their research. So we've been very good at being aggressive, but we've got to make sure we're continuing that. And I think that's the challenge for the state moving forward, is how do we handle this? And a part of that, you've been involved with Uber Elevate. I mean, the state needs a mobility plan to move around 41 million people. We've had a tremendous advantage when it comes to time to job, cost of living of housing, and over time, just like any enterprise, we're gonna face shrinking advantages. Right now, the gap is huge between us and California and Illinois or New York. The question is, how do we prevent becoming California, Illinois, or New York when it comes to cost of living, cost of doing business. And so we believe that's with the utilization of big data. Our government's way behind on the utilization of data. When you look at healthcare, for instance, we're not using healthcare data the way we should, and healthcare cost and outcomes are an issue in our state. That's got to be faced, but it can be and it can be done in an affordable way if you have a plan and you're investing incrementally over time. What's happened in other states, they wait till the issues build up, then there's a huge public demand, you throw money at the problem, taxes go up, business runs away, and you're in the downward spiral. We believe we can still, while we're in the good times, make sure we don't face these problems. But you might talk about Uber Elevate.
Yeah, I think, but I want a minute, but Texas 2036 is not a new concept because we had Texas 2000. And so the reason we can handle the growth we have today is what our leadership did in the 80s under Governor Clements. And what Tom is now doing is Texas 2036, which is our bicentennial for the state, making sure that we are ready for the next round of growth. I mean, Dallas-Fort Worth in the 80s, we were about 3.5 million people, and now we're 8. And so we did it. We more than doubled. And we just finished $18 billion of new roads in the market. We built 4 new airports over that period of time. The Texas voters approved the new water bonds, so we have plenty of water in the state. So you get road money coming, water money coming in, but also it's a real free market philosophy that when it comes to roads, it's all the above. We do the traditional roads, and we do the toll roads, and we do the managed lanes. And that's one reason you could leverage so much money into the road system is we brought private dollars in for the roads, which have worked very well. And so it's that economic freedom that gives us the ability to constantly adapt to the growth that's coming in. And then Uber Elevate. We started helping Uber on the first Uber Elevate concept. Uber plans to have 20,000 flying vehicles across the United States. And it really is, if you remember the Jetsons, it's kind of like the Jetsons. And the question will be, with the cost of flying going down and becoming more and more affordable, you've got 300 companies in the world now developing new flying vehicles. And we just had a big conference called Texas Up that we hosted at the Circle T Ranch about 2 months ago. We had 150 entrepreneurs in from around the world basically working on what will these flying vehicles look like. And Boeing's involved, Airbus is involved, Bell's involved, all the big guys, but then also all the entrepreneurs. And you've got flying vehicles that are coming that are stunning. And being a long time, I don't want to say old pilot, but being a pilot for a long time, I'd listen to all the Uber guys come in. And of course, all the older pilots are very skeptical, but it's important that you always stay open-minded. And so I told our guys, I go, look, we're going to support it. We're going to help them. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work. And to me, it's not really, will this work? It's going to be, when will this work? I believe that a lot of the tech guys are far more optimistic on the timing because they hadn't really hit the FAA yet. And there's a lot of bureaucracy out there in aviation. And there should be. And in our country, we want flying to be very, very safe. And so we actually have an airline. So I'm used to this airline business. And they come in and brief me on stuff. And after about 10 minutes, I go, okay, that's it. That's all I can take. I mean, the bureaucracy is staggering to keep flying safe. And so what's interesting, though, is you're seeing a lot of the new vehicles in China because they're not as worried about safety. And you've got autonomous flying vehicles in China right now that'll fly from point A to point B. And the CEO of the company will leave his home, fly to work, all done automatically. Well, that will be coming into the United States. Google now has a new flying vehicle, not under Google, but under the founders of Google, that basically you're going to be able to get into the vehicle without any training and fly the vehicle. And that prototype is flying now in California. And so the vision of what Uber Elevate will be is that everybody in the world, 20% of the world is flown today. The vision is to get 100% of the global population having access to aviation. And that's where this technology is going to go, and it's going to transform our cities. It's going to transform real estate. And we're on the real estate side of this. And the first vertiport has already been built up at Frisco, and the first beta run will be DFW Airport to Frisco. and should start later this year with Uber in a traditional helicopter, just to let Uber Elevate start to figure out how this is going to work as they get up the learning curve. But it's very exciting. Great new technologies will come from it. And our goal, aviation is a great technology center. North Texas is one of the main aviation technology centers in the world. And we want to have these new products in Texas. And we want to make sure the manufacturing is done here, the maintenance is here, and the training is here. And again, our governor is very involved and very supportive, as with our mayors and with DFW Airport, helping Uber get launched. So it's a very exciting time of a new industry that's coming.
I see we've got about 6 minutes left. You want to open up for questions or any questions?
You know, I'm very impressed by everything you guys are saying and all the things that are happening, and I certainly agree with you. The one thing we're not saying is something I heard this morning from our Nobel Laureate panel was we're having trouble attracting people here because of the state of our education system.
Yeah.
Now we're not talking about the higher education system,
Right.
which we all agree is fantastic.
Right.
And we're doing great things in Texas. But I'm worried because if it weren't for Mississippi and Alabama, when it comes to the health of our population, when it comes to the education of our population in general, we are at the bottom.
Let me challenge part of what you say, and let me tell you, I want to correct one factor in what you said, because I've lived this cycle, and we turn downward. Let me tell you the glass half full, and that is from 1983, when his father started working on K through 12, to 2011, this state led, not Mississippi and Alabama, but led the country in increase of academic achievement of the African American and Hispanic population and the white population. Now, that came from a low base of about 48th, but we moved up to 25th in the entire country in a relatively short period of time. In 2011, the state took $5 billion out of the K through 12 education system funding and decreased standards in 2011 by decreasing math and science requirements. So beginning in 2011 to 2016, we began to decline again. That's one of the reasons that we started the 2036 effort, is because we believe we must rebuild the momentum that was created really by his father. But I think there is a growing awareness in the state that we took the foot off the pedal, and we, as I said earlier, we're in a race to see if we can turn around again our K through 12 system, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to fill these jobs that are going to be needed in the future. So I agree with part of what you said, but I don't think it's an impossible task because we've done it once before. And it takes a long time. The education pipeline is long, but we've just expanded, for instance, early childhood education, made a major new investment in that. That's critical. But there's more to be done on the education front. Trust me, if I looked at one summary of the issue the state faces over the next 20 years, it is we need a large, employable workforce. Large means we have to keep migration growing. Employable means we have to continue to improve the education system and healthcare outcomes. Right now, we have 1.2 million unfilled jobs in the state and only 500,000 unemployed people. And those 500,000 do not qualify for the 1,200,000 unfilled jobs. So, yes, we have our challenges, but believe me, we're not behind the eight ball like our competitor states are. And again, I wouldn't trade places with other states given looking across the state. And part of what Text 2036 has done is measure Texas against all the other 49 states, because we believe any enterprise must be looking at what are the strategic challenges you face down the road. And we face many challenges down the road. And a particular one is healthcare cost, healthcare outcomes, and we face a tremendous issue in terms of access to healthcare and affordability of healthcare.
So on the topic of innovation of research, there seem to be two narratives have emerged. One is the building of infrastructure and investment in education, and let's just call that the infrastructure narrative. The other narrative is that these crazy people keep cropping up.
Right.
Mike Maples,
Yeah.
he referred to the successful entrepreneurs as being a special kind of crazy. And the innovations here in information technology services seem to be attributable to this one special guy who emerged in '83 or whatever. Can you comment on the relative, or how to reconcile, or the relative importance of those two narratives, the infrastructure versus the special kind of crazy?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact we've got to do a better job of encouraging more capital to come to the state to reward those. And I choose to call them those special people, those unicorns that are there. Our academic institutions have to do a better job. I listened to part of the discussion the other day about, rewarding academic papers versus, making sure you take a product into commercialization. But, UT Southwestern has had several home runs in terms of commercialization. But I think part of that is we need to increase the venture capital, second stage capital. We don't have as much capital here as should be reflected by the economic output of our state. There's a lot of wealth here, but how we connect that to our academic institutions in a better way is really important. And I heard a lot of discussion yesterday, which I agree. We've got to do a better job of building the innovation ecosystems in communities. I know Southwestern's working on that, Lyda Hill, other people, but that innovation ecosystem is there. But Dallas is really a tech center, and it's really interesting how many jobs in this market are really tech-driven and what I'd call mid-skill jobs. But I think a future challenge for the state and for the country really is how in the world are we going to build a lifelong learning system so that we can deal with job displacement as we come to more and more automation, more and more innovation. Because the old way of just saying we're going to lay off 100,000 people doesn't work when you have a shrinking workforce, labor force. And you look at our population needs, we're going to have to deal with how do we reskill and upskill people. And our system of education and credentialing is not set up to do that. So there's a lot of issues that we confront, but goodness, I wouldn't trade places with any other state as to where we are in the ability to deal with those issues. But those special people are important. And again, I call them unicorns, not crazy, because I've been around some unicorns, and they can create a lot of unbelievable things happen that are pretty remarkable. I remember, I'll tell one last story about Ross Sr. This was in the late 70s. He called me one day, said he wanted to take me horseback riding. Well, he was my largest client, so I said, of course, I'd love to go horseback riding. And he picked me up, he had a horse trailer to connect to his truck, and he said, I need to drive you out to see a piece of property. And he drove me out, those of you in the audience that are from Dallas, he drove me out to what is now Legacy. It's about, 10, 15,000 acres. He said, well, I want to build downtown Dallas right here. And I'm looking around on horseback. I can't see a rooftop. I can't see a road. And I said, yes, sir, I'll get right on it. And I said, but can you give me something to sell? I said, why exactly do you think you can build downtown Dallas right here? He said, it's simple. And he said, the competition in the next 50 years in the world is going to be for talent. Talent wants affordable public schools, good public schools, and affordable housing. And he said, we can make that happen right here, and that will draw the major corporations from all over the country to come here because they're going to be competing for talent. So it's always about competing for talent. And that's the number one job of the state, is how do we keep competing for talent.
And your legacy is almost as large as downtown Dallas today.
Larger. I went and checked.
Larger than downtown Dallas
today. It has more people employed
Yeah.
in legacy than are employed in downtown Dallas today.
I'm really short, so I'm just going to pull this down. So I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here.
You got here as quick as you could.
Yes, sir. I know everyone's heard that before, but thinking about attracting talent here, I moved here for a reason. How do we maintain the character of Texas with all of the external talent coming in? And I'm referring to things like low taxes and the entrepreneurial spirit that I think exists here.
I think it's a great question, but I think it's one that really Texas 2036 is dedicated to doing. We formed this as a nonpartisan, non-ideological organization, basically to try to attract what I'd call the mobilizing the middle. The people who moved here understand the reasons, the power of Texas, what made Texas special. And there's so many people today that are disengaged, and this is an issue with an entrepreneurial state. Our entrepreneurial state often says, I remember early days, I went on Michael Dell's board in '91. He said, I don't want anything to do with the government. And I said, well, okay, Michael, but someday the government's going to want something to do with you. And so, sure enough, later you had to pay attention. And I think we have to show people they're so disengaged from the lack of long-term leadership, long-term big plans, that we want to force upon the public officials to say, yes, we know things are great right now, but what about over the horizon? And our motto is, how do we keep Texas the number one place to live and do business? How do we keep it? And I think that's something we have to focus people on. You can once win the national championship, it's tough to repeat. And the issue is, how do you remain on top? And I'm convinced the way you do that, because we're dealing with large public institutions, is by a long-term strategic plan, incremental change over time that you can afford, and that will foster the entrepreneurial spirit we're talking about. There's a wonderful quote from T.R. Fehrenbach that said, out of the frontier experience, it made Texans empirical, hard-headed, and it made them determined to face the future in a positive manner. And I think that's the attitude of most Texans, and I think we can do that. But it's never easy to remain on top of your game. There's always challenges ahead.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm actually a native of Texas. I'm from Denton. So I appreciate what you've done and what your family has done for this state. The Perot Museum is one of my daughter's favorite places to go.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that you do that your family has that over there. My wife is a high school teacher, and much like your father, she believes that not just athletes should be celebrated. But at the same time, I think we should also be putting the money towards the teachers who are teaching in the STEM subjects. So I wonder if there's a way for something like 2036 to incentivize districts to hire really excellent STEM teachers, and incentivize those districts and incentivize those teachers to be there and stay there and even come to Texas, because we have people coming here. They may already be teachers, but they may not be thinking about teaching. But if they maybe were getting more incentives to be teaching in the schools, then people like my daughter right now, not in 2036, could be getting the kind of education that we need.
Totally agree. And I'll tell you a funny story about his father. He once asked me to try to write into legislation that every school district would be required to pay one math teacher as much as they paid their football coach. That was a line too far. That was a line too far. We got away with no pass, no play, but we couldn't quite get there about football coaches. But very clearly, Text 2036 is focused on, if you stop and think about it, there's only so many levers that exist in state policy. State policy either spends more money or less money. And then, though, just as important is what does it incentivize and what does it disincentivize? And too often times we disincentivize the conduct we want versus incentivizing. And so we're looking at how do we incentivize the conduct we want, how do we remove disincentives, how do we remove regulatory barriers, while understanding, we got water quality issues, yes, and we're not doing a good enough job on water quality or on air quality. So you have to find the right balance. But those are issues that are faced, and clearly STEM teachers are one. But let me give you an example. This state today, when we first worked on education reform in 1983-84, by law, we paid woodshop teachers more than any other teacher in the classroom. We paid agricultural vocational education teachers more than any classroom teacher. That was by law. We got that changed. So you have to focus on what do we really need. And if you look across our state, building our STEM workforce and building math, science, engineering, and it's a constant battle. I hear it all the time. Why does my child need to take Algebra 2? I haven't used the formula. I'm a lawyer. I'm a lobbyist. I don't use formula. No, but that taught you how to critically think. And so it's a constant battle, but that's why we need the public engaged in what will make this state remain unique over the next 20 years.
Thank you.